Community property rights. Fair share in a constrained world. Common property regime is when the resource use is controlled or regulated by an identifiable community of users. There is recognition that each community member is capable of subtracting from the welfare of others. This means that non-community members are excluded. However, recognize that the definition of community is not absolute and needs to be defined. Membership is by right or by invitation. Ownership of resources is actually a bundle of rights. It contains the right to possess the resource, the right to the fruits of the resources, the right to use the actual resource, the right to use the property according to how you see it fit, the right to recover the resources, and the right to dispose of it. Therefore, the path to establish community property rights is not necessarily through ownership of the resources, but through establishing ownership of rights. Take note that these rights exist even if there is no ownership of resources. A lot of communities already exercise these rights even though they do not own the resources. While the theory of collective action is silent on the issue of power, the struggle to establish community property rights entails empowerment of communities. We push for transformative asset reform by advocating for the establishment of property rights for the community. This allows communities to stake their claim over resources they depend on. It would help if we could look at this matrix which distinguishes private from public properties and bundles of rights being possessed by individuals or communities. To have more control and security over resources, we would want to have the resources to be more private than public. To exercise community asset reform, we want these privatized resources to be claimed by the community instead of being cornered by individuals or corporations. A clear example of private property rights by individuals are land titles. Individuals are able to take care of their resources and exclude others, effectively using these rights. But of course, it results to high levels of inequity, especially if limited resources are possessed by the rich and powerful minority. Example of public property for individuals are leases, permits, concessions, and exclusive privileges. While the owner is still the state, the same issues on inequality is experienced when the rich and powerful are provided privileges over state resources. Examples of stretching rights over public property for communities include the provision of preferential use of the 15-kilometer municipal waters for small-scale fishers. Take note that in the law, the community referred here is based on the low levels of capital invested by the small fisherfolk, and not necessarily people living in a specific municipality. A municipal ordinance can be passed, which can further refine the definition of the community. For example, it can be made exclusive to people living in a certain municipality or barangay. The community-based forest management agreements is another example of communal public property, wherein organizations are provided rights over forest resources for a long enough time for them to benefit from the fruits of these resources. A breakthrough in terms of providing communal private property is the Indigenous Peoples' Rights Act. While there have been a lot of frustration in the implementation of IPRA, it became a landmark law simply because it recognized the rights of the indigenous people. Previously, merely mentioning the Regalian Doctrine will silence any argument that the indigenous people have over their land. With the IPRA, it is recognized that their ancestral rights preceded the Regalian Doctrine. The state and other claimants are now on the defensive to grab the indigenous land instead of the other way around. Pickwitt-Burks described the co-management of the commons between the government and the community as having its own hierarchy, similar to the ladders of participation of Arnstein. At the lowest level with more government-based management is informing, wherein communities are merely informed of the rules, very similar to what the IITF is doing in managing the pandemic. We move up a little with consultations. Again, this is not really co-management since what the community says is not necessarily what is being done. From consultation, we go into cooperation, better communication, better information exchange between the government and the community. Slowly, the community becomes an advisory body to the government. More joint action is done. In partnerships, there is better recognition of the role of the communities in managing the resources. Used to be that community control was the peak of this hierarchy, but later on, inter-area coordination was added in recognition of the network of small community-based natural resource management efforts. This simulates the large ecosystem-based sustainable natural resource management that scientists are pushing for. But the clear takeaway from this hierarchy is that we should shift the focus on the process of rules making and not just the rules. Participation has its own value. Eventually, compliance or the discipline being demanded from citizens will be born out of the belief on the wisdom of the rule and not on the fear of sanctions. Any questions?